First of all, thank you so much for joining. I really appreciate you finding the time, and I was super excited to hear from you when I got your email. I think you're doing so many amazing things. Can you do like a little intro for our audience, somebody who doesn't know what you're doing? Give us a little bit of a background and like what are your current projects?
My name is Jasmine Katatikarn. I am the co-founder of the Academy of Animated Art. I also have 20 years of experience specifically in lighting. Over 10 years of that time was in feature animation at Blue Sky Studios, where I was a senior lighter. And then the other half of that time, I worked in visual effects, where I was a CG lead at Frame Store and worked at companies like The Mill. Currently, I am also a tech art manager at Amazon. And yeah, and I'm happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
It's not often that we have people in our podcast that can talk about kind of like animation industry. Although animation is like one of the most profitable, I guess, businesses in entertainment. Like it's such huge companies, like Pixar and Sony. I know everyone else. Like the new Spider-Man film is like blowing up box office. But surprisingly, we have a lot of people from VFX. We have a lot of people from games, but not a lot of people who actually do animation. And I guess it would be nice for our audience just to learn where we are with this kind of industry currently, right? So I think we all know this wonderful story of kind of like Steve Jobs coming and saving, I would not know if it's a good way of phrasing it, Pixar, and then selling Pixar, and then Disney doing all this stuff, and then, CGI kind of like becoming the standard for animation right now in films and movies and TV and basically everywhere. Can you give us a little bit of a kind of like where we are right now, like how easy it is to start working in animation? How accessible are these tools? What are like the biggest changes in, Maya in general? Like, do you still need to do everything by hand, or do you rely a lot of like on algorithms or motion capture? I know it's a very broad thing, but just to kind of like give us a little bit of an idea, if you take animation industry now, and animation industry 10, 15 years ago, what were kind of like the biggest kind of like tectonic shifts in the production process?
Interesting. Yeah, because I do have experience in both, right? Feature animation and VFX. And I will say at its core, they use very similar softwares, right? That can translate very easily. The biggest difference that I find between feature animation and VFX is, one, usually the timeline would be the biggest thing. I feel like feature animation has that a more luxurious, and I say luxurious, but it's still a pretty tight time frame usually for productions than, let's say, a VFX turnover time. And the biggest difference is, I'll say, like, the same thing applies from the lighting perspective, because that's my background, is if I would look 10 years prior, rendering, right? The rendering engines, the same way that you think of the improvements with VFX, animation did kind of have that same improvements in speed as we go. New developments, RenderMan, whatnot, definitely plays a key role in source things like that. I would say my big thing, though, I feel like there is the difference between VFX and animation is kind of how you approach the problem, where I always find my analogy for this is VFX to me is like baking. And now stay with me. But VFX is baking, animation's cooking. And I often get asked a lot, where should I go? Should I go into animation? Should I go into VFX? And like I said, at its core, I think I stand by the principles of the foundational core that you understand light can apply to both. And same thing with 3D, right? It depends on what kind of work do you like better. And when someone asked me, I said, well, do you like to cook or do you like to bake? And they kind of look at me. And the reason I say this is because anyone that kind of knows those kind of crafts, like baking is very precise. It's super technical, precision. You have to get the measurements just right. And anything that is off, you could taste it. Usually, like, it's very technical in that way. Where cooking, you have a lot more flexibility, right? You can throw a dash here, and you can kind of make it up a little bit as you go. It's more free flowing, and you can come up with a masterpiece. And that's where I feel like animation, especially within lighting, really comes into play, because you can throw like these crazy color lights in there that don't really relate to reality, but it's beautiful and it works. But you couldn't do the same in VFX where you're lighting something against a plate, right? You can just put a random pink rim light on something. So I don't know if this answers your question, but I mean, that's the core of it. I don't think there's such a difference between animation and VFX as people might think. I think the biggest difference is the type of work, obviously, and if you like to be more of the cooking side versus the baking side, and the time frames. Because what I'll say when I work in VFX, that I'll get a day on a shot, right? Depending on the turnaround, where that same shot in an animation production, I could be working on it for months. And it's this iteration and the refinement. And I will say, when I worked in feature animation, I honed my eye so much because there was that time to keep on getting the notes, keep on improving my craft. Where in VFX is kind of like a lot of times, like, it's got to go out, it's done. So that is the main difference. And then for like just the differences within the last 10 years, I feel like, the core of the craft stays the same, but technology changes, right? And then with technology, you play with more, like the biggest thing on the lighting side, compositing, I feel has played such a big role, where in the very beginning, it was kind of compositing was done, but not really leveraged. Where towards now, I feel like softwares like Nuke, really allow the artists to leverage the compositing software within lighting so much more, which that I did not see like 10 years ago. So I think that's how tech is kind of helping us along and helps speed up the process too, and lets us iterate faster.
I love this analogy of kind of baking and cooking. As I'm very good at cooking, and my wife is very good at baking. So I guess we'd go into different departments if we ended up at Disney or somewhere. And yeah, I kind of want to build up, because we're speaking in these analogies. I have another analogy I had in mind, and maybe you can play around with that as well. So when I think about kind of like a lighting artist and an animator, I think about kind of like almost like an actor, an animator as an actor, right? Who does a lot of movement, kind of like does a lot of referencing, kind of works with himself, and then kind of like translates this into the character. And you can see this very nicely in a lot of the kind of beautiful videos and animators on, a lot of the Pixar films and Spider-Man. I put it out online because they are the reference sort of. And when the lighting artist, I almost think of I would say a photographer or like a cameraman, where I guess cameraman has more flexibility with lighting because you can work with the lighting. You can put the light here, put the light there, and I guess photographer can do that as well. But like when you go out on the street and you take like a camera with you and you just try to capture light on this and kind of like tell a story through lighting, because it's all there is basically to photography, is just trying to catch the light. It's kind of do you think it's a good analogy? Do you think it's true, more or less? And kind of like talk to us more about kind of like, what do you see on a very like high level? Like, what is the kind of like the purpose and the goal of a lighting artist in film?
Yeah, I think that's a great analogy. I mean, to bring it one step further, another thing I ask people when they ask me, "Oh, where should I go into lighting? Should I be an animator?" Another thing you can ask yourself is when you watch a movie or anything, what's your big takeaway afterwards? Is it the acting? Like, oh my God, that was so moving. Or was it the visuals, like the cinematography? And that's very telling, right? If your big takeaway was the acting, then animation, right? If your big focus is like the look and the feel of it, the mood, the cinematography, like you said, photography, then you're kind of probably more geared towards lighting. I will say for me, I instantly knew. I remember in school when it came to like the animating part, I like animated in like a day. I'd be like, oh, I'm done here. But then on the lighting side, with the looked up development side, I could be there in there for like weeks, right? So I think people tend to understand, like they might not realize, but they're already kind of geared towards that. And I will say, photography, like you said, is on point. Many lighters. I personally have a hobby in photography. Almost, almost every light. I don't want to say every lighter, but it's a common thread that lighting artists are probably photographers on the side. You know, it goes hand in hand with what how we craft the story. Like you said, lighting is essentially another form of storytelling, but it's through light. It's creating that mood for the viewer. So on that high level, if if a person's more inclined towards the visuals, the cinematography, and crafting that mood through light, it's kind of this invisible art that I really love. It's like focusing the viewer's eye, things you don't think about, focusing the viewer's eye on where you want them to look in that story. That's through light, right? If like the animator could animate something beautifully, but if the lighter like decides to put that animation in the darkness and highlight the lamp in front, instead the viewers could be looking there. So we're all here to tell a story, and for a lighter, it's through light, and through like an animator, it's through that the acting. So yeah, that's kind of my take on. So to answer your question, you're on point with like that's how I'd see it as well.
Awesome. Well, thank you for the compliment. I really thought about that analogy. And my question is, when you were saying kind of that you're using light to tell a story and so on, and I watched a lot of the kind of like stories on not story, like videos and breakdowns and storytelling and the kind of thing, especially in film and so on, and like the classical examples from like Spielberg and all those other great directors. And I think one of the examples that really stands out to me is the lecture that Mike Hill did on Jurassic Park, and I think it was called kind of like subconscious storytelling, and the idea was that although it's kind of like this high concept story about the dinosaurs and so on, it is also about family. It is also about kind of like light and dark, and kind of like about all those archetypical things that you can find in any story and so on. And his thesis was that he's not sure how much Spielberg was actually thinking about all those kind of like layers on the layers, but since he was just like a very good director, he was just subconsciously adding all that stuff in a film, and that's why it stands the test of time. And my question for lighting is kind of like, how much of this art craft is subconscious, where it's just kind of like, you see light and dark and the mood is there, and it's kind of like, materializes, and how much is actually theory, looking at pictures, looking at classical art and going to school and so on. So give us a little bit of this idea, because I can for sure tell you that people would say, well, art is such a, lighting seems like such an obvious thing, right? If it's dark, it's kind of gloomy, right? And when it's bright, it's kind of like more happy, right? So is there really that much of that you need to learn there?
I would say I think yes, there is in the way. It's interesting. Lighting is all around us, right? We see it every day, and I do think of lighting, the art of lighting, as an invisible art, like an invisible skill, and that, especially for VFX, the best lighting, you never notice it because it's invisible. If that's like you did a great job, right? Um, in animation, it's portraying that mood or whatever you're trying to portray. But for any field, I would argue, but especially for lighting, you need to learn the foundations of what are you seeing, because yes, everyone can see light, and you could say like, yeah, that's dark, that's, but do you know the real intricacies behind it? Like, what makes up a shadow? The shadow can tell you so much. Is it a soft shadow? Is it a hard shadow? What's the density of it? What's the color of it? And like, what's actually contributing to that color, right? And it's only by really deep diving and understanding at its core what's going on in lighting. And this is why if anyone's interested in lighting, I always say, like, go back to the basics. And it is about studying the Rembrandts, right? It's the original lighting artist, and how are you looking at light? Just like, and you can do it in your everyday space, like taking a glass and saying like, how is this light? Like, I'm seeing the reflections. Oh, that's interesting. Like, the more you look, then you can really kind of start dissecting and how light's interacting with it. And only then, it's kind of like, what's that phrase? If you learn you got to learn the basics in order to break the rules later. And that's the same. Like, if you have that core knowledge of how light works, then the things to look for that you might not notice in your everyday, but you'll notice if it's wrong, right? But you'll notice if someone will notice if it's wrong, but it's really difficult to isolate what is wrong with that, and then to have the ability to create something that, it's a creation in itself through the lighting. So to answer that is, yeah, you need that core foundation. Then, and this is like, regardless of software, that's, I think, one of the biggest mistakes I see people doing. They're like, I want to go into lighting. They just go straight into the software, and they're like, which buttons can I click? Which IBL, which HDR do I need to put in there? But no, before you even do that, you have to understand what you're looking for. And then you go to the technical of like how to achieve that, because software is just a tool, but you need your eye to know where to go with it, if that makes sense.
It's funny you were saying about this invisible art thing, because a couple of, I think it's even this week, we recorded a podcast with a composer and a music producer, and he said the same thing. He said like the greatest sound in a game is the sound that does not distract you from the thing, right? But it kind of like enhances your and I guess the same would go for camera because like nobody really sees the camera, right? If it's too distracting, then like, well, maybe he's just showing off too much. But I just still think that even though you call it invisible, there is a great craft to it. Like, you have to make sure that you're doing the right thing in order for kind of like not to break this illusion that you're trying to create with animation. And I guess my question is, and it's kind of like related to the work that you're doing in your school, is how do you approach this? Like, how do you start studying this kind of like art? Like, what are the steps that you need to do? Maybe you can talk a little bit about your experience, kind of like trying to build this curriculum, trying to build the ideas and that go into the program, and how does it help people kind of like eventually grow into professionals?
Yeah. So step back, I'll relate to my own education. When I was being taught lighting, I was just Maya was put in front of me, and then we just went through the buttons of like, this is a spotlight, this is a director, like very mechanical. And what I found years later, and honestly not until I went to Blue Sky Studios, and this was after years of experience where I thought I was like a professional lighter, I knew it all, my mind got blown because I realized I had missed the core thing, which is the foundations of why we light, what to look for, right? So that's why when we developed the program at the Academy of Anime Art is we're like, okay, software is going to be there, of course, but the approach is secondary because softwares change all the time as well. So the way we developed it is our students started off with the program called The Power of Light. And it's a combination of like the foundation. It teaches you the foundation. We talk about, the old Rembrandt paintings to dissecting existing animated movies. What's making it the way it is? How are they setting the mood? We talk about how the use of like defocusing helps draw that eye, like dissecting an old Disney frame, something that I would have never thought about, but it's very evident. Like you said, there's a formula, right? They're using contrasting colors. They're also making the background less busy and even like so that the foreground character really stands out, right? So it's those things that we highlight in that first class. So they get those cores of what's going on, the light against dark, the dark against light, complementary colors, the tones. And then what we do in that course too is everything's tactical, right? They are still going to be in the software. We give them this one of my favorite exercises is a very simple scene. It's just with geo, like spheres and, rectangles. And they pick a frame of a movie, anything that they are inspired by the lighting. And then they work to recreate that lighting within this simple, primitive environment. And it's amazing the mood that you can portray with inanimate objects, right? And it just shows, and it kind of takes away that daunting feeling like, oh, to light, it has to be like this character or something moving. It brings it back to the core. And then they really focus on the shaping. Oh, that's also a very key part of lighting is how do you shape an object, right? And the use of color and mood. And you can even take that same scene and light it 3 different ways. And that's a challenge in itself. Like, how can you change the mood of this just by your lighting selections? How can you change where the viewer's eye is going? And it's in these seemingly simple exercises, but I think they're actually one of the most beneficial someone can do, especially starting out, to create that foundation. And then from there, then they move on to, after that core class, they move on to character lighting for animation or environment lighting for animation to, compositing for animation and whatnot. So they do go into the specialties after there where they can kind of develop even further, but it's that core that we start them off at. So they have a solid base. And we find that really excels the lighting skills quickly. And then they, our students go on to go to DreamWorks and Disney's and the Sony's, and it's amazing to see that development happen.
It's always nice to hear when schools not only talk about kind of like how great their teachers are, how great the course is, but also about the placement, right? So how you actually will eventually get a job and so on. And my question is like, what are kind of like studios looking for right now in people who want to do animation? Like, what are the things that they require, both in terms of kind of like hard skills and soft skills, and also who are these people who are hiring? Like, is this like, because we want to think about animation, especially here, like in Los Angeles, we think like, okay, so there you go to Burbank, you knock on the door, and then there's like Walt Disney, and you try to do something there, right? But who else is there? Like, who's hiring for these positions? Like, is it only like a handful of companies, or are there a lot of them? And what are they looking for in candidates?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, because all of us know the big name companies, right? Like the Disneys, the Pixars, the DreamWorks. But there are a ton of little shops. We actually have link our students to a spreadsheet, an industry spreadsheet that's not run by us, that kind of houses all the studios, also with the job openings. and I'm happy to link it here as well. And it's one thing that I'll say about like who's hiring. There's a lot of small shops out there, right? I mean, and when I say small, I'm just saying not as maybe well known as like the Disney's and Pixar's, and content is in demand quite heavily, especially animation content, right? And the 3D expertise is still quite a niche, like in the whole world, where it's really hard to find people with 3D skills. And within that, lighting is quite a specialty because many people tend to go more towards like the animation route or the modeling route, right? But lighting, it's a specialty in itself. So for the people that are looking, I'd say like there's so many studios out there. They're small. I'll link to the spreadsheet. They're all around the world too. I'm seeing more opportunity for remote, but there's a lot of the bigger studios that are basically coming back in person too. So that's kind of like figuring out what, if you're willing to move or if you want to be pure remote. But the good news is there's something for everyone. It just, you need to kind of craft it for that. And to answer like, what are they looking for? They're looking to see if one, you can tell a story through your lighting, and that your lighting's solid. And what that means is like, how's your shaping? Like I mentioned shaping briefly before, but it's very easy to just shine a light on something, right? But most often it could fall flat. And you've probably seen like a super flat object, right? But if you have the power or the superpower, the lighting power to craft that and shape it and make it a visually appealing, frame and story and the use of light, then that is essentially what people are looking for. Can you light a scene? One of the easiest things I tell students, because it does feel daunting, some of my, like the students come up like, well, I don't work at, Pixar or DreamWorks, so I don't have these elaborate scenes in my demo reel. So no one's going to be able to, take me seriously. But it's really, especially if you're applying to a studio and they understand, many people don't have that. But especially looking at student reels, what I want to see, and I've looked at many reels, is can you tell a story? Do you know the principles of lighting? Like, can I tell that you can, create a nice, ratio? Everyone talks about 3-point lighting. It's not quite 3-point lighting, but it's like, can you craft that visual and create a story? And one of the most powerful things I think someone can do is take the same scene and light it 3 different ways and show 3 different stories from that scene. And that's powerful. And that's showing me, okay, you know how to light, you know how to tell a story through lighting. Let's get this person on board. I'm looking to see if the artist has the eye for lighting, right? They're not just pushing buttons and submitting something. There's a very clear difference between the two. So, and it's not as daunting essentially as what you might think when you feel like you need some professional animation. You just need a single scene and then a software and then that foundational knowledge to tell that story.
So you mentioned that there is this huge demand for content, and I guess everyone can kind of relate to that, right? Now we have like 10 different streaming services, all of them doing some crazy animation. And back in the day when I was just getting into animation, it was very hard. You would most likely go to somewhere like, France or in Japan, they would do something not interesting, experimental. And now it's like almost everywhere. And does this kind of like interest increase the interest from potential candidates? Like, are there more people who are actually interested in doing this? And also, how do kind of like the people who are paying for this education, like their parents or their guardians, how do they feel about it? Like, is there a change in perspective almost, and how they see these new professions? I mean, not new, but professions connected with entertainment. Do you feel like being an artist now is actually something that, a parent would be happy about his child pursuing? Or is there still like this little bit of a misunderstanding going on?
Yeah, I love that you brought that up because, you know, when I was a child, I was very passionate about art, but then I was always strongly discouraged not to pursue it. I was told very quickly I couldn't take it seriously. If anything, it's a hobby, but I need to focus on being a doctor and or a lawyer. And honestly, I listened because I was a child. So what else did I know? I was like, oh, okay, that's bad. I need to do this in order to be quote unquote successful and happy. And it took me until my 20s. I have an economics degree until I finally allowed myself to branch out into a creative field. And this is only when I found animation. And I loved it. It was a hybrid, it was creative, it was technical. And I will say to this day, now my parents are super proud of me. They're like, oh my God, you found your way. And they love it now. But past, they were definitely not supportive. So to answer the question is like, I think the stigma is still there. It comes with awareness that is not out there yet. I mean, people still think about arts when someone says, "Oh, I want to be creative. I'm going to the arts." I think most parents and people still go directly towards the painter, right? The fine artist that's like struggling, and nobody wants their child or anyone to go towards that. So to speak to that, I think it's still there. I think it's changing in the fact that it is more apparent, like especially in gaming. And we're seeing more of like the STEM and the robotics come into play. So I think if uh, putting animation in that kind of STEM field, which I see happening, parents will kind of get a little bit more on board with it. But there's still much to be gained in that area. And I will say it's also on the education of the young person side where I'm working with the younger generation to kind of make them aware that animation is even a possibility, right? So I think it comes from twofold. Like my focus, I'd say, is educate the young person about how, like all the possibilities instead of focusing on the parents, let's say, and opening up their minds. Because I think that's where it's really going to, one, be most effective for that individual person. And then eventually, just like my parents, it's like, oh, you're like, good, like successful in your mind, I guess. And you made it happen instead of trying to change that stigma right away.
Yeah, it's almost like when you're trying to talk about it, you need to talk from kind of like bottom up and then top down. So you talk to parents as well, and you talk to students. So somewhere in between, they're gonna meet and kind of learn more about it. I have and thank you for sharing. I think it was a very inspirational story. So I guess the last question that I have is, especially since we were talking about kind of like careers and technology and kind of like this idea of how people can find job. What do you think? Do you have a lot of fears maybe coming from the community about this new machine learning technologies that seem to be disrupting the art production in general? Is this more like a threat to what you're doing, or is this more just like another tool that you're going to use in the future?
Yeah. First, I'll say this is purely my opinion on it. So it's no one else's. The way I looked at it is it's another tool. I mean, yes, I could see where the threat is coming, right? Like, oh my God, I think everyone had that moment, no matter what industry you're in, really, with all the AI and machine learning that's going on. Everyone's like, oh, that's it. My job's, gone. But what AI doesn't have is the like human creativity level. Yes, it can produce images as we're seeing it, but you still need a user behind that. You still need to craft it. You can see like some people can take an AI tool and like create these amazing things, but the other person next to them can't do that, right? And it's because there is a difference with the person using the tool. And I'll keep saying tool because that's how I'm looking at it, right? I'm super curious. How can I leverage this tool to help me elevate, help me grow, help me explore and create in different ways that I couldn't do before, right? I mean, I've heard some people give the analogy to like the camera. When the camera first came out, everyone was like very upset about it. They thought it was over. But now look at the camera now. A whole different field has come through multiple fields because of the camera coming in as a tool. So while, yes, you could look at all the machine learning, the AI coming in as a fear thing or a scary thing, or you could see, this is like the prime opportunity now to go explore, be curious. Because the one thing I find inspiring about, there's no expert on this. Everyone's kind of on that same level of like, ooh, what's going on there? What's going on there? And this is the time to get into it and then see how you can use it for yourself and to expand your studio or whatnot. So my take on it is don't be afraid of it. Instead, leverage it. And then think of it as another creation tool that perhaps you couldn't do before. Like I have a lot of friends that are now, their ability to become more of a storyteller, right? They're using it to where in the past, maybe it would have been impossible. It would have taken a team of like 20 people to create their vision. But now as a creative, you can take a story and maybe by looking into the tools and that are out there now, create that and make that a reality, bring it to the next level. So I'm actually super excited about it because I'm looking at it from that way. And I feel like I'm almost in school again, right? Where I get to really like explore and be like, ooh, what's that? And I've seen so many creative applications that people might not think about for their use, like their, use cases that are so exciting to see. And that's a creative thing in itself, right? So I find it super exciting. And I think if you're afraid, then leverage that fear and see how can you make it work for you? And that goes for anything, right? It goes the visual AI machine learning to, your everyday writing. Like, how can you make it work for you? Because it's here. That's my perspective. It's here. It's not going anywhere. If anything, it's going to grow. So this is the time to really dig deep. I mean, like learn about it and then leverage it. That makes sense. So that's my take on it. But yeah, I think things might change. Yeah, I was gonna say.
I mean, it's all we're just sharing opinions, of course. Like we don't really know. Nobody really knows how it's gonna develop. So yeah, that's kind of like what people find scary, but it's also, like you said, it's exciting to see what other opportunities it might bring. Jasmine, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. It was wonderful talking to you. We'll leave the links to the school so people might, explore, figure out, maybe sign up with you and so on. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks for enjoying another episode of the 80 Level Roundtable podcast. Check out upcoming episodes on the 80 Level website at 80.lv. Join our career site at 80.lv/RFP. And share our podcast with friends and on your social networks.